The morning sun of June 4th, 1942, cast long shadows across the Pacific as Admiral Kiichi Nagumo peered through his binoculars from the bridge of the carrier. Akagi, the largest naval armada Japan had ever assembled, stretched. Across the horizon, 4 fleet carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, all bearing down on a tiny coral atoll that most Americans had never heard of until this moment. Midway. Nagumo's weathered face betrayed no emotion. As he watched the first wave of 108 aircraft launch from his carriers at 6:30 in the morning, the rhythmic thunder of engines filled the air as Nakajima Type 97 attack bombers, Aichi Type 99 dive bombers, and Mitsubishi Type 0 fighters rose into the dawn sky like a deadly swarm. This was Operation Mi Admiral Izuroku, Yamamoto's masterstroke designed to lure the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet to a decisive battle and crush them once and for all. The plan was audacious in its scope. While Nagumo's carrier striking force pounded Midway into submission, Yamamoto himself would follow with the main body, including the mighty battleship Yamato. American forces, rushing to defend their strategic outpost, would sail directly into Japan's carefully laid trap. Rising Sun would finally achieve the decisive victory that had eluded them since Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. But 300 miles to the northeast, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard the carrier Enterprise was already turning his Task Force 16 into the wind. Unknown to the Japanese, American codebreakers had penetrated their naval communications, revealing not just the target, but the entire battle plan. The hunters had become the hunted, though neither side yet realized the magnitude of what was about to unfold as Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led his bombers toward Midway. Radio chatter crackled across the Japanese frequencies. The Americans were not caught sleeping as they had been at Pearl Harbor. Marine fighters were already climbing to meet them, while shore-based artillery prepared to contest every inch of the tiny island's airstrips and installations. On Midway itself, Marine Colonel Harold Shannon watched through his field glasses as the first specks appeared on the horizon. The island's complement of outdated Brewster Buffalo fighters and a handful of newer Grumman Wildcats scrambled to meet the incoming threat. Their pilots knowing they faced overwhelming odds, but determined to sell their lives dearly. The first bombs began falling on Midway at precisely 6:35, erupting in massive geysers of sand and coral. The Japanese pilots, veterans of campaigns from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon, pressed their attacks with ruthless efficiency. Fuel dumps erupted in towering columns of black smoke, while hangars collapsed under the weight of high explosive bombs. Yet, as Tominaga circled the burning atoll, his radio crackled with an ominous message. There is need for a second attack. The Americans were still fighting, their defenses bloodied, but not broken. The Coral Fortress continued to spit defiance through its anti-aircraft guns and the few surviving aircraft that rose to challenge the attackers. As the first wave of Japanese bombers turned for home, neither Nagumo nor Tominaga could have imagined that their carefully orchestrated plan was already beginning to unravel. Hidden beyond the horizon, American torpedo bombers and dive bombers were already winging their way toward the Japanese fleet, guided by radio intercepts and the smoke trails of the returning attackers. The stage was set for one of history's most decisive naval battles. Admiral Nagumo stood rigid on Akagi's bridge as lieutenant. Tominaga's report crackled through the radio at 700 hours. There's need for a second attack. The words hit like a physical blow. According to intelligence, Midway should have been defended by nothing more than a token garrison and obsolete aircraft. Yet the American base continued to function, its runways operational and its guns still firing. The Admiral's staff officers exchanged nervous glances as Nagumo weighed his options. On the hangar decks below, the second wave of aircraft sat armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes, weapons designed for attacking ships, not ground targets. To strike Midway again, they would need to be rearmed with high-explosive bombs, suitable for destroying land installations. Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactician who had helped plan Pearl Harbor, urged caution. "Admiral, we should maintain our readiness for naval combat," he argued, his voice tense with concern. The Americans may have ships in the area, but the pressure of the moment weighed heavily. Midway's continued resistance, threatened the entire operation. If the island's airstrips remained operational, American bombers could continue launching attacks against the invasion fleet. Nagumo made his fateful decision at 7:15, commence rearming aircraft for second attack on Midway.
What?
Followed was organized chaos in the carrier's hangar decks. Sweating ordnance crews began the laborious process of switching weapons while fuel lines snaked across the steel floors. Torpedoes were carefully wheeled away as high explosive bombs were brought forward. The process would take nearly an hour 60, precious minutes during which the Japanese fleet would remain vulnerable, according to records maintained by the U.S. Naval Historical Center. It was at 7:28 that scout planes finally reported the presence of American naval forces. Tone 4 launched late due to catapult problems. It transmitted the electrifying message. Enemy ships, 10 ships, apparently including one carrier, be bearing 10 degrees northeast, distance 240 miles. The message hit Nagumo's bridge. Like a thunderbolt. A carrier. Here. The intelligence had assured them that the Americans had only 2 operational carriers in the entire Pacific, and both were supposed to be near the Solomon Islands. Yet here was unmistakable proof that American naval forces were not only present, but close enough to launch an attack. Nagumo's mind raced through the implications. His aircraft were being rearmed for a second strike on Midway, leaving him temporarily defenseless against naval attack. Worse, if American carriers were in the area, they might already have launched their own strike force. The hunter was about to become the prey. Suspend rearming operations, Nagumo ordered, his voice cutting through the bridge's tension. 2 arm aircraft for naval attack. The order sent shockwaves through the fleet. Onakagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu ordnance crews scrambled to reverse their work. High explosive bombs were wheeled away as armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes were brought back up from storage. But time was no longer Japan's ally. At 8:37, Tone 4 sent another report that chilled every man on the bridge. Enemy force, accompanied by what appears to be aircraft carrier. The Americans weren't just present, they were in force. They undoubtedly knew about the Japanese fleet's position, as if to confirm their worst fears. Lookouts began reporting aircraft approaching from the east. Grumman, Avenger torpedo bombers. From Midway were boring and low over the water, their crews determined to press home attacks despite facing overwhelming odds. The American base might be battered, but it was far from defeated. Nagumo's carefully orchestrated plan was disintegrating before his eyes. Aircraft were caught in the middle of rearming operations, making them useless for either defensive or offensive operations. The first American attacks were already inbound, and somewhere beyond the horizon lurked American carriers with the potential to deliver a knockout blow. The Battle of Midway had begun in earnest, and Japan's advantage was evaporating with each passing minute. At 8:37 on the morning of June 4th, the first American blood was drawn in anger as 6 Grumman Avenger torpedo bombers from Midway roared in just above the wavetops toward Nagumo's carriers. Lieutenant Langdon Fieberling led his squadron in a desperate attack that would set the tone for the carnage to follow. The Japanese combat air patrol rose to meet them like angry hornets. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Ataya, flying a Type 0 fighter, dove from 8,000 feet with his wingman close behind. The Zero's 20mm cannon and twin machine guns tore into the lumbering American torpedo bombers with devastating effect. One by one, the Avengers twisted into the sea, their crews fighting their aircraft to the bitter end. Only Ensign Albert Ernest survived the slaughter. His aircraft riddled with holes, his gunner dead, his radio operator wounded. As he nursed his dying Avenger back toward Midway, 5 more had joined their comrades in the Pacific's depths. The Japanese defenders had drawn first blood, but it would not be the last American sacrifice of the day. The respite was brief. At 9:18, 14 Army Air Force Boeing BTN-6 Marauder medium bombers appeared on the horizon, skimming the water at masthead height. Captain James Collins led this second wave of attackers, their modified aircraft carrying torpedoes. Instead of their usual bomb loads, pilots trained for high-altitude bombing were attempting something for which they had barely trained, a low-level torpedo attack against maneuvering warships, The Japanese defenders reacted with practiced efficiency. Admiral Nagumo's carriers began violent evasive maneuvers while every anti-aircraft gun in the fleet opened fire. The sky filled with black bursts of flak and the red tracery of machine gun fire. The marauders designed for bombing missions over? Europe proved ill-suited for naval combat in the Pacific. Captain Collins pressed his attack against the carrier Akagi with suicidal determination. His bomber, streaming fire from multiple hits, held course until the last possible moment before releasing its torpedo and cartwheeling into the sea. Behind him, his squadron mates met similar fates as the Japanese combat air patrol tore through their formation like wolves among sheep. 2 marauders limped away from the carnage, their crews traumatized but alive. 12 had been shot down, their twisted wreckage marking the graves of brave men who had given everything in a futile attempt to damage the enemy fleet. Yet still no Japanese ship had been seriously damaged. Admiral Nagumo might have been forgiven for thinking his force was invincible as he surveyed the wreckage of the second American attack. His carriers continued their high-speed evasive maneuvers, while his aircraft completed their rearming operations. Soon, his own strike force would be ready to launch against the American carriers that had dared to challenge the might of the Imperial Japanese Navy. But the admiral's confidence was premature. At 9:25, radar operators aboard his ships detected another formation approaching from the southeast. This time, it was 15 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bombers from the 7th Air Force. Flying at 20,000 feet under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Walter Sweeney, the high-altitude bombers represented a different kind of threat. Unlike the low-flying torpedo bombers, the Flying Fortresses operated beyond the reach of most Japanese fighters and relied on precision bombing from extreme altitude. Their crews, veterans of training missions over the American mainland, believed they could land decisive blows on the enemy fleet. The results were no more successful than the previous attacks. From 4 miles above the Pacific, the American bombardiers struggled to hit maneuvering targets that looked like tiny dots against the vast ocean. Bombs exploded in towering waterspouts around the Japanese ships, but none found their mark. The carriers continued their weaving dance across the Pacific, untouched and seemingly untouchable, as the Flying Fortresses droned away toward their base. Nagumo's staff officers began to relax. 3 separate American attacks had accomplished nothing beyond the destruction of their own aircraft and crews. Japanese losses had been minimal, a handful of fighters damaged, some near misses from bombs, but no significant damage to any vessel in the fleet. Yet unknown to the Japanese commanders, the real threat was still approaching. High above the Pacific, Douglas Dauntless dive bombers from Task Forces 16 and 17 were winging their way toward a rendezvous with destiny. Guided by the smoke trails of the returning Japanese fighters and the wisdom of aggressive American commanders who understood that fortune favors the bold. At 10:24 on the morning of June 4th, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led his 15 Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers from USS Hornet in a shallow descent toward the Japanese fleet. Torpedo Squadron 8 had been flying for over 2 hours, searching the empty Pacific for an enemy that seemed to exist only in intelligence reports and radio intercepts. Waldron, part Cherokee aviator from South Dakota, had spent the previous evening writing letters to his wife and daughter. Something in his warrior's intuition told him that few of his men would see another sunset. As he spotted the distinctive pagoda masts of Japanese warships on the horizon, he keyed his radio microphone for what would be his final transmission. Attack immediately. I am going in. The Devastators, obsolete even by 1942 standards, lumbered toward their targets at barely 150 knots. Their crews knew they were flying death trap slow, lightly armed aircraft that had to fly straight and level during their torpedo runs, making them perfect targets for enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The Japanese combat air patrol fell upon them like avenging angels. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, the veteran fighter leader, led his Zeros down from altitude in textbook attacks. The sky filled with the chatter of machine guns and the deeper bark of 20mm cannon as the Japanese fighters tore through the American formation, one by one. The Devastators fell into the Pacific. Waldron's aircraft, riddled with bullets, cartwheeled into the sea with its crew still aboard. Behind him, squadron mates met similar fates as the Japanese defenders pressed home their attacks with ruthless efficiency. Within minutes, 14 of the 15 torpedo bombers had been shot down, their crews joining the growing list of American heroes who had given their lives in the defense of Midway. Only Ensign George Gay survived the massacre, clinging to a seat cushion in the oil-slicked water as Japanese destroyers churned past him. From his position in the sea, he would witness the climax of the battle that would decide the fate of the Pacific War: the slaughter of Torpedo. Squadron 8 was followed by similar disasters for the torpedo bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led Torpedo Squadron 6 into the same maelstrom that had claimed Waldron's men, with equally devastating results. Of the 14 devastators that began the attack, only 4 would return to their carrier, most of them badly damaged. Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey's Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown met a similar fate. The Japanese fighters, now operating with clockwork precision, intercepted each American formation before it could reach effective torpedo range. The Pacific was littered with the wreckage of American aircraft and the bodies of crews who had pressed their attacks with suicidal courage. From Admiral Nagumo's perspective aboard Akagi, the battle seemed to be following a predictable pattern. American aircraft continued to attack his fleet in piecemeal fashion, allowing his fighters to destroy them before they could inflict serious damage. His carriers remained untouched, his aircraft were nearly ready for launch, and victory seemed within reach. But the sacrifice of the American torpedo squadrons had not been in vain. By attacking at low altitude, they had drawn the entire Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, leaving the upper altitudes undefended. The Japanese fighters, their fuel tanks nearly empty after continuous combat, were milling about at low altitude, unable to climb quickly enough to meet a high-altitude threat at 10:22. Just as the last devastator was falling in flames, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led 37 Douglas dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise in a screaming dive toward the Japanese carriers. The Scout Bombing Squadron 6 and Bombing Squadron 6 had been airborne for 3 hours, searching for an enemy that had seemed to vanish into the vastness of the Pacific. Mick CLU Sky, a veteran pilot with ice water in his veins, had made a crucial decision earlier in the flight. When his scheduled intercept point proved empty, it continued searching rather than returning to his carrier with his bomb still aboard. His persistence was about to pay dividends that would change the course of history. As the Dauntlesses rolled into their dives from 14,000 feet, Japanese lookouts finally spotted them. But it was too late. The American dive bombers were already committed to their attacks, screaming down through the morning sky at speeds approaching 300 knots. The hunters had finally become the prey at 10:24 and 30 seconds. Aviation machinists mate First Class Bruno Godot aboard the carrier. Enterprise watched through his rear gunner's position as Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's Dauntless rolled into its dive toward the Japanese carrier Kaga. What followed in the next 5 minutes would be remembered as the most decisive moment in the Pacific War. The Japanese carriers, caught in the middle of rearming and refueling operations, presented perfect targets for the screaming American dive bombers. Flight decks crowded with aircraft, fuel lines snaking across hangar spaces, and ordnance scattered throughout the ships created conditions that would turn each carrier into a potential inferno. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading the second section of dive bombers, selected the flagship Akagi as his target. The massive carrier, Admiral Nagumo's pride and joy, was frantically maneuvering to avoid the diving Americans. Her flight deck was crowded with aircraft being prepared for launch, their fuel tanks topped off and their ordnance loaded. Best's 1,000-pound bombs struck Akagi amidships, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the upper hangar space. The blast ignited aviation fuel and touched off a chain reaction among the armed aircraft waiting for launch. Within seconds, secondary explosions began tearing through the ship's vitals as fuel and ammunition cooked off in sympathetic detonations. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's Bombing Squadron 3 from USS Yorktown was attacking the carrier Soryu. Leslie, who had lost his own bomb due to an electrical malfunction, watched as his squadron mates pressed home their attacks with devastating precision. 3 direct hits turned Soryu into a floating pyre. Her flight deck buckled and twisted by massive internal explosions. The carrier Kaga, veteran of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids, suffered perhaps the worst fate of all, for direct hits from Enterprise dive bombers started fires that quickly spread throughout the ship. Her aviation fuel storage areas erupted in towering columns of flame that could be seen for miles across the Pacific. According to documentation preserved in Samuel Eliot Morrison's official naval history of United States naval operations in World War II, the devastation was complete and irreversible within minutes. 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers were transformed from instruments of conquest into funeral pyres for their crews. Admiral Nagumo, his flagship burning beneath his feet, stood transfixed on Akagi's bridge as his carefully planned offensive dissolved into chaos. The ship's damage control parties fought desperately to contain the fires, but the blazes had taken hold in too many places simultaneously. Smoke poured from the hangar decks as explosions continued to rock the dying ship. Captain Taijiro Aoki, Akagi's commanding officer, pleaded with the admiral to transfer his flag to another vessel. "Sir, the ship is lost," he reported, his voice barely audible over the sound of continuing explosions. "We must abandon ship immediately." But Nagumo seemed paralyzed by the magnitude of the disaster. 3 carriers destroyed in 5 minutes. It seemed impossible that American naval aviation could have achieved such devastating results. The same force that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had ranged across the Indian Ocean, destroying British naval power, had been cut down by pilots who 6 months earlier had been training over the California desert. On the remaining carrier, Hiryu, Rear Admiral Taemon Yamaguchi watched the destruction of his colleagues' ships with grim determination. His carrier was still operational, her aircraft still capable of striking back at the Americans who had delivered this devastating blow. The battle was not over not, while Japanese carriers remained afloat and capable of launching aircraft. Yamaguchi immediately ordered a retaliatory strike against the American fleet. 15 Aichi Type 99 dive bombers and 6.0 fighters rose from Hiryu's deck under the command of Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. Their target was the American carrier that had launched the devastating attack, Enterprise, or one of her sister ships. But even as Hiryu's aircraft climbed toward their targets, the strategic balance in the Pacific had shifted irrevocably. Japan's elite carrier air crews, veterans of campaigns from Hawaii to Ceylon, were dying in the flames that consumed their ships. The aircraft that had been poised to strike American installations were being destroyed on their flight decks, along with the irreplaceable pilots who had made Japan's naval aviation the most feared force in the Pacific, the Rising Sun's Pacific Empire, built on the foundation of carrier-based air power, was crumbling in the smoke and flames that marked the funeral pyres of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. The 5 minutes between 10:24 and 10:29 had changed the course of World War II and sealed the fate of the Japanese Empire. Rear Admiral Taemon Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of the carrier Hiryu at 1100 hours. Watching columns of black smoke mark the graves of 3 Japanese fleet carriers. The elite carrier striking force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months was dying before his eyes. But Yamaguchi was not ready to concede defeat. A samurai's son who had studied at Princeton University before the war, Yamaguchi understood both Eastern honor and Western tactics. His carrier was still operational, her aircraft still deadly, and the American fleet remained vulnerable somewhere beyond the horizon. If he could locate and destroy the enemy carriers, Japan might still salvage victory from the jaws of disaster. Launch immediate strike against American fleet, he ordered his staff. Within minutes, 18 Aichi Type 99 dive bombers and 6.0 fighters were climbing away from Hiryu's deck under Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi's command. The pilots, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean campaigns, flew with the knowledge that they carried Japan's hopes on their wings. Meanwhile, 3 miles away, Admiral Nagumo finally abandoned his burning flagship. As Akagi's magazines continued to explode beneath him, the admiral transferred to the light cruiser Nagara, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. The architect of Pearl Harbor had seen his carefully planned operation destroyed in less than an hour by an enemy he had underestimated. At noon exactly, Kobayashi's strike force found their target. The American carrier Yorktown, separated from her escorts and conducting flight operations, presented a tempting target for the veteran Japanese air crews. Captain Elliot Buckmaster's ship had already survived the Battle of the Coral Sea and bore the scars of previous encounters with Japanese naval aviation. The attack developed with textbook precision. Kobayashi's dive bombers screamed down through heavy anti-aircraft fire while his Zero escorts engaged American fighters trying to intercept the strike. 3 bombs found their mark on Yorktown's flight deck, starting fires and jamming her elevators. The carrier began listing to port as her damage. Control parties fought to save their ship, but Yamaguchi's triumph was short-lived. Even as Yorktown burned, American search planes were vectoring toward Harry's position. Lieutenant Samuel Adams, flying a scout bomber from Enterprise, had located the last operational Japanese carrier and was reporting her position to Admiral Raymond Spruance's task force. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, 24 Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise arrived over Hiryu like avenging angels. Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher led the attack against Japan's last hope for victory in the Pacific. The irony was complete. The same squadrons that had destroyed 3 Japanese carriers that morning were now poised to eliminate the 4th. Hiryu, caught with aircraft on deck being prepared for a second strike against the American fleet, suffered the same fate as her sister ships. 4 direct hits from 1,000-pound bombs started fires that quickly spread throughout the carrier aviation. Fuel ignited in massive explosions that could be seen and heard across the entire battle area. Admiral Yamaguchi, the last samurai of Japan's carrier force, chose to go down with his ship. As Hiryu burned around him, he composed a final message to his emperor: "I alone am to blame for the loss of Hiryu and the failure of our mission. I shall remain aboard this ship and share the fate of my men." By sunset on June 4th, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers were either sunk or sinking. The elite air crews that had made Pearl Harbor possible, that had terrorized the Indian Ocean and threatened Australia, were dead or dying in the Pacific's depths. Japan's naval aviation had been reduced from the world's most powerful carrier. Forced to a collection of burning wrecks in less than 24 hours, the Americans had paid a price as well. Yorktown, despite heroic damage control efforts, would eventually succumb to her wounds. Torpedo Squadron 8 had been virtually wiped out, along with significant portions of other torpedo squadrons. But these losses, grievous as they were, paled in comparison to the destruction visited upon Japan's irreplaceable carrier fleet. As darkness fell over the Pacific on June 4th, the strategic balance of World War II had been permanently altered. Japan's ability to project naval power across the Pacific was broken. Her offensive capability shattered by 5 minutes of devastating American dive-bombing attacks. The Empire of the Rising Sun, which had seemed unstoppable 6 months earlier, was now fighting for its very survival. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the devastating news aboard his flagship, Yamato, at 1800 hours on June 4th, the architect of Pearl Harbor. The man who had warned his government that Japan could run wild in the Pacific for only 6 months, watched his prediction come true with prophetic accuracy as reports filtered in from the battle area. All 4 carriers lost, the communications officer reported, his voice barely above a whisper. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu all sunk or sinking, casualties extremely heavy among aircrew personnel. Yamamoto, the chess master who had planned Japan's Pacific offensive with meticulous care, understood the implications immediately. His combined fleet still possessed overwhelming surface-strength battleships, cruisers and destroyers that could sweep any American surface force from the seas. But without carrier-based air power, these ships were helpless in the face of land-based aircraft from Midway and the American carriers that remained. Operational. The Admiral's staff officers looked to him expectantly, hoping their commander could salvage something from the disaster. Some urged an immediate night surface attack against the American fleet, using Japan's superior night fighting capabilities to achieve the decisive victory that had eluded them during daylight hours. But Yamamoto was too experienced a strategist to throw good money after bad. "Signal all units," he ordered quietly. "Operation Me is cancelled. All forces will withdraw to the northwest immediately." The decision marked the end of Japanese offensive operations in the Pacific War. As the surviving ships of the combined fleet turned away from Midway, they carried with them the broken dreams of an empire that had reached too far and grasped too much. Behind them, the waters around Midway were littered with the debris of Japan's ambitions. Oil slicks marked the graves of 4 fleet carriers, while life rafts carried the survivors of what had been the most powerful naval aviation force in the world. Many of Japan's most experienced pilots, veterans of campaigns from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon, would never see their homeland again. The human cost was staggering. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen had perished in the battle, including irreplaceable flight crews that had taken years to train. Captain Jisaku Okada of the carrier Kaga, Rear Admiral Timon Yamaguchi of Hiryu, and hundreds of other experienced officers were gone, taking with them decades of naval expertise that Japan could not replace. American losses, while significant, were comparatively light. The carrier Yorktown and destroyer Hamon were sunk, along with 147 aircraft and 307 personnel. But the United States possessed the industrial capacity and training infrastructure to replace both ships and crews. Japan, isolated and resource-poor, did not. As dawn broke on June 5th, strategic situation in the Pacific had been revolutionized. Japanese naval strength, which had seemed overwhelming just 24 hours earlier, was revealed to be a hollow shell. The combined fleet surface units remained formidable. They were toothless without the air cover that only carriers could provide. More importantly, the myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered. The same naval aviation that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had sunk British battleships off Malaya and terrorized the Indian Ocean, had been comprehensively defeated by American air crews who had learned their trade in the 6 months since December 7th. The Battle of Midway marked the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific. Never again would Japanese forces launch a major offensive operation. From Midway forward, the Empire of the Rising Sun would fight a defensive war against an American industrial machine that grew stronger with each passing month. Admiral Yamamoto, watching the sun set over the Pacific on June 5th, understood that his country had lost more than 4 aircraft carriers at Midway. Japan had lost the war itself, though the fighting would continue for 3 more bloody years before Emperor Hirohito finally acknowledged defeat. The coral atoll of Midway, barely visible on most maps, had become the graveyard of Japanese naval supremacy and the birthplace of American victory in the Pacific War. Japan's strike force had indeed been cut down by Midway's overwhelming response, not just the response of the tiny garrison that defended the island, but the response of a nation awakened to its destiny as the arsenal of democracy.